So good afternoon. It is a great pleasure to welcome you today to the Nova School of Law and the Nova Consumer Lab for the fifth talk of this series of talks. And what a great panel we have here today. I particularly thank Madalena, Narciso and Christoph Busch for their willingness to participate in this event. I take this opportunity to pay a heartfelt tribute to Professor Carlos Ferreira de Almeida, who unfortunately left us this week. It is a huge shock for the university, for the Nova Consumer Lab, and for me. It is also a huge loss for the law, and in particular for consumer law. Professor Carlos Ferreira de Almeida was the forerunner of consumer law in Portugal, but I'm sure he will continue to follow us wherever he is right now. Today, we will talk about a very interesting topic, reviews and endorsements in digital marketplaces. We have with us Pedro Ferreira, who is a researcher at the Nova Consumer Lab and is carrying out a thesis on law and technology at the Nova School of Law. We then have with us two of the experts who have most studied this topic in Europe, perhaps in the world. Madalena Narciso is a PhD researcher and lecturer at the Maastricht University. Her doctoral research focused on the reform of the information paradigm in European consumer contract law, particularly by looking at alternative sources of consumer information in the digital economy, such as online review mechanisms. Christoph Busch is professor at the University of Osnabrück in Germany and a visiting fellow at Yale. His research has been focused on consumer and contract law in digital markets and algorithmic regulation. Christoph is a fellow and council member of the European Law Institute, ELI, coordinator of the ELI Digital Law Group and co-director of the ELI project group on online intermediary platforms. He's member of the European Commission's expert group for the Observatory on the Online Platform Economy, which provides advice for the EU policy on digital platforms. Christoph is also co-founder and editor of the Journal of European Consumer and Market Law. We both share this last task. It is a great pleasure to have a colleague and a friend here with us today. As you can see, this event will certainly be very interesting. We will have two presentations, followed by a commentary by Professor Christoph Busch. At the end, we will have a short debate. Feel free to write your questions in the chat or use the raise hand button at the end. And now I give the floor to Pedro. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Hold on, just sharing my screen. Yeah, here we go. Sorry. Okay. So hello, thank you for the invite, Professor. It's a pleasure to be here, and hello to everyone watching. I'm going to do an introductory presentation about reviews and endorsements in digital marketplaces, and I will explore the importance of online reviews for private law, and also explore the problems that stem from it. And at the end, I will lay down the applicable European consumer directives that concern the actions of online traders and what they must do to protect consumers' interests and rights. So let's get on with it. Online reviews have become an indispensable part of consumers' decision-making processes, as people benefit from sharing opinions and experiences about the quality and usability of goods and services. So reviews are seen as a tool to spread information, and in the last 20 years, the e-commerce world has become widely available and influential, while millions of consumers not only produce but also rely on ratings and reviews produced by other consumers to help them make more informed purchasing decisions. And businesses foster the adoption of these systems because they have realized the power that ratings and reviews have over consumer purchasing behavior. And these are valuable advertising instruments without which many businesses could not survive. However, online reviews are often unreliable and are not representative of all consumers' opinions. They can be biased or they can be faked, for example, to increase the business reputation. And these issues damage consumer protection by misleading them and also by damaging their trust in the market. So online marketplaces essentially are services which function as intermediaries between consumers and businesses, and they represent a meeting place for both parties. And this can appear as a form of website or application. And whether it is online or offline, consumers need the necessary confidence and trust to buy a relatively unknown product or service. And the way businesses achieve this goal in online marketplaces is through reputation systems. Because sharing opinions and experiences about the quality and functionality of products can be beneficial for both consumers and businesses. And as a result, information asymmetries between all the market participants in the contracts are decreased. And as I said before, consumers can make more informed decisions. In turn, if businesses have positive or negative ratings or reviews, it will often be an indicator of how high or low sales are respectively. I included here as an example the first review I found about the new model of Amazon's Alexa as an example, and review in here refers to the written opinion about the product, and the ratings are the non-written recognition of goods and services. And endorsements, which are an extremely lucrative business nowadays. Actually, Business Insider UK sees that the amount of money that is going to be spent on influencer marketing in the next year is set to reach between 5 billion and 10 billion British pounds. So it's really lucrative, and these reviews differ from normal reviews because they're commonly created by people such as celebrities and social media influencers, and this will have a bigger impact in consumers' decision-making process. So brands aim to gain the consumer's trust in their products. However, these reviews and the whole review system can be unreliable and can lead to even further information asymmetries. Reviews are the most efficient way of getting consumers' attention, and they reach millions of people at almost zero costs. And however, the review system has not completely fulfilled its mission of limiting information asymmetries in a contract between the parties and to be a true measure of quality. And manipulated reviews and endorsements impose a very important legal issue that will influence consumers' contractual decisions and affect the parties involved in the transaction. Say if an online review or endorsement is not based on a genuine user experience or shows elements of bias, it can mislead consumers into purchasing products or services that don't match the presented characteristics in the platform, and therefore the trust in online platforms is diminished, and sellers nonetheless will be damaged by fake reviews, and this will often lower their revenues. So the review system is often unreliable, and it is possible to distinguish between three legally relevant types of unreliable or misleading reviews, and I will briefly go through each one of them to see what problems can come from an unreliable review system and why it is important to regulate them. The first category of unreliable reviews is precisely the lack of them, and most people read online reviews before purchasing an item. Yet, since they're voluntary, they will usually refrain from posting one themselves, and for that reason, the chain of reviewing is broken, and future consumers will not benefit from their reviews. This contributes inevitably to the problem of information asymmetries and will ultimately corrupt the review system. People avoid reviewing because they have a fear of retaliation from the other party to the contracts, or they have a social desire to maintain a certain status quo and they don't want to be seen online. And also the time it takes to register in a specific website to leave a review. But not just the time, but also the fact that consumers will only take the time to leave a review, either when they have positive feedback or when they have extreme feelings about the product. And this is why there's a lack of average reviews in most platforms. making the whole review system positively inflated. And this is the biggest issue. And it leads to the second category of online reviews of unreliability, which concerns biased reviews, and they occur when a consumer is affected by bias and writes a review that doesn't match his or her real opinion. And this is connected to a lack of incentives and high costs of leaving a review. And the result of this problem is that reviews in online marketplaces are regularly positively biased, which produces what some scholars refer to as reputation inflation. And this presents an obstacle to a solid online experience, since it is extremely unlikely that such a high number of opinions are positive. Besides, a study by the Competition and Market Authority showed that 20% of users who declared in private to have had a negative experience gave the highest possible score in a public platform. And platforms like eBay have realized this and saw that 99% of most sellers had over 99% of ratings. And they discovered that biased reviews can happen essentially because of two reasons. And one is the fear of retaliation. And this is oftentimes described as the fear felt by consumers that if they give a negative review, the trader will write a negative comment directed as the consumer as a form of revenge. There's also the fear that negative review will have consequences in the real world, such as harassment done by the trader, since the marketplace has access to his or her personal data. And the other reason is because of social desirability. And this phenomenon is the hardest to track and the hardest to stop, because this phenomenon happens when a consumer has some sort of empathy with the trader and doesn't want to leave a negative review, and also relates to phenomena like the herding effect. And this happens when you have a product in an online platform and let's say the first 20 reviews are positive. The 21st review, that person will have an incentive to leave also a positive review instead of a negative, even if it had a negative experience, because of the herd effect. The third category of unreliability is concerns fake reviews. That's these are reviews that are not based on a real experience, and the motives behind this come from someone, usually the trader, who wants to promote a business or to harm another business reputation. It could be also threat or blackmailing. Plus, there are services online whose main practice is fake reviewing, posing themselves as an advertising company. And these so-called fake review factories are groups mainly on Facebook, where the companies themselves, they post the details of their products, seeking positive reviews, and they reimburse the reviewer for them. And this has harmful effects. But of course, negative reviews produce more damage than overly positive reviews, especially to small-scale businesses. This is another reason why some businesses don't want to stop bias in their reviews, because bias can be positive for their products, and it will lead to more sales. But misleading or fake reviews undermine the consumer's confidence in the whole integrity of online reviews and leads to consumer detriment, and thus competition will be reduced. So it is a problem that concerns both individual consumers and online markets. And digital platforms and other businesses that use ratings and reviews have been making efforts to reduce the number of unreliable reviews, and they do this by the use of algorithms or machine learning, but they're not completely capable of mitigating this problem. So online platforms have to make sure the information in them is truthful, but designing a system that incentivizes honest reviews and at the same time penalizes deceptive comments remains the challenge here, because a system that has a low threshold might be easily manipulated by providers, but complex systems will face limited consumer participation. So this is the big challenge. Now, Concerning the regulatory framework for review mechanisms, in short, the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, or UCPD, established general prohibition for consumer practices that alter the consumer's economic behavior, and essentially causing the consumer to make a transaction that he would not have taken otherwise. And this provision is in line with the principle of proportionality, as well as the principle of private autonomy, that states that contractual decisions must be free and clear of distortions. And I would say that as a whole, the UCPD has done a considerably good job at protecting the consumer over the years, although recently consumers across the EU have been affected by abusive practices online. And this reality has weakened consumer trust in single markets and sparked a debate about whether the EU has strong enough mechanisms to handle this. So as a timeline, the European Commission conducted an evaluation of consumer protection 2017 through the Regulatory Fitness and Performance Program, or REFIT. The modernize that the level of compliance is strengthened to guarantee a fair single market for consumers and businesses, both in the present and the future, in a way ensuring its legislative significance and effectiveness through the ongoing technological revolution. And as a result, the package of measures known as the New Deal for Consumers came to life, and that is centered in online marketplaces and the problems that stem from it. A fundamental part of the EU's New Deal for Consumers is the Enforcement and Modernization Directive, also known as Omnibus Directive, which entered into force in January 2020, and it strengthens consumer rights through improved enforcement measures and also enhanced transparency requirements, particularly to online review systems. So the Commission responded to the issues suggested by the evaluation of the REFITs and implemented new commercial practices that are considered unfair in any circumstance. So this is where I'll focus our attention here, to this implementation of commercial practices which are considered unfair in any circumstance. And the first change in the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive is the introduction of a new commercial practice which prohibits traders from providing search results without clearly revealing any paid advertisement or payment, specifically for achieving a higher ranking of products within the search results. But ranking in this context is defined as the corresponding relevance given to products in the way they're presented by the trader. And this relates also to online reviews. When someone searches a product, which review is shown first and why. So traders, they don't need to reveal the complete functioning of the ranking system. Instead, traders should provide a general explanation. Nevertheless, this obligation to give a description of the system is not severe enough to be presented in a customized way for all individual search queries, so it's very general. The second commercial practice that is considered unfair in all circumstances and therefore prohibited is stating that reviews are submitted by verified consumers who have used or purchased the product without taking reasonable and proportionate steps to check that they originate from such consumers. This is a very important one because the Omnibus Directive implemented this amendment to make reviews more reliable. Finally, it is considered unfair in all circumstances the commercial practice of submitting another person to write false reviews or endorsements, or misrepresenting reviews or endorsements in order to promote products. Before this amendment was implemented, the misuse of online reviews was only considered a misleading commercial practice if it was contained in one of the paragraphs of Article 6 of the UCPD, and it fulfilled a specific requirement that said that the review is likely to cause a transactional decision that he or she would not have taken otherwise. Well, the Omnibus Directive here takes it one step further and states that the misrepresentation of reviews or endorsements is a commercial practice which is in all circumstances considered unfair, completely erasing any doubts one might have had before. So the inclusion of these commercial practices in the catalog of practices that are considered unfair in all circumstances comes in a time where specific measures regarding online reviews, the mechanisms had to finally be regulated by the EU consumer law to guarantee a certain level of consumer protection. And consequently, this suggests that the EU has to look at online reviews as an important factor in the creation of both online and offline contracts, and should provide a coherent regime to treat this type of information essentially as any other statement made by the trader, because they can influence the consumer's trust. So that's it for me. Thank you. If you have any questions, you can send me an email. I will leave the floor to my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Can you please stop sharing your screen? Thank you so much. And now, Madalena, the floor is yours. Thank you again for being here. In 5 talks, Madalena is here for the second time. It means also that she's studying these topics we are also addressing here in these talks. Thank you so much, Madalena.
Oh, thank you for the invitation. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for having something devoted to online reviews, because I've spoken in other places about reviews, but I don't think I've ever seen just a talk or a panel on online reviews. So I was very excited. As Professor Morais Carvalho said, this is the topic of my PhD. So, I struggled more than I thought preparing this presentation, because obviously I wanted to talk about everything that I find interesting and relevant about reviews. But particularly today, I'm going to talk about not of online reviews as the object of regulation. My colleague Pedro did that wonderfully in his presentation. I'm going to talk about online reviews as a source of regulation or a source of inspiration for regulation. The topic of my PhD, just to give you some context on why I'm doing this, is looking at all the shortcomings that the information paradigm in consumer law suffers from. I don't have to repeat them again. The typical problem of consumers don't read terms and conditions. It's a bit more in depth than this. But then we take this source of information, so the information paradigm, information duties, that is failing in some sense, and we look at another source of information or an alternative information paradigm that is flourishing, which is online reviews. As Pedro said, millions and millions and millions of consumers read reviews, and this influences the conclusion of consumer contracts every day, and more so. So empirical research actually shows an increase in the relevance of reviews. So my question is, sure, reviews are a problem, reviews can be unreliable, but how else can reviews matter for consumer law? How else can we use them when it comes to consumer law? I look specifically at online reviews as pre-contractual information. So it's information that is provided to the consumer before the conclusion of a contract. That information is at times provided by a party to a certain contract. Sometimes it might be construed as a third-party statement. That's also something I'm going to talk about in a bit. Just to give you also a bit more numbers, again, reviews are an overwhelmingly undeniable phenomenon. 80% of consumers read reviews before making a purchase, both online or offline. 90% of travelers consult reviews before planning a trip. 90% of consumers read reviews to determine whether a business is good or bad. So it's really, really everywhere. And these numbers are already from a couple of years ago, so they don't really represent reality of today. And then we have a very, very big variety of reviews that you can have. So, you have the typical reviews on restaurants, hotels, books, cars. But then you also have reviews on attorneys, doctors, teachers, gardeners. It covers a very, very broad variety of contracts. Again, to give you a representational number, TripAdvisor reports over 859 million reviews. And as I said, research shows an increasing trend. And it's interesting because I am writing my PhD on a topic now, but I also wrote my master thesis a few years ago on this. And every time I talk about this, I always update TripAdvisor's numbers of reviews, and every year it increases exponentially, right? So you can tell how much this is growing. From these numbers, and also from what Pedro said in his presentation earlier, we can conclude one thing, right? Consumers want to know what other consumers think in order to make some decisions. But it's not just this. If we take this aspect that I just mentioned, we can see how information that is conveyed through online reviews is a complement or is complementary to information to the information that is disclosed as a result of information duties, which I'm going to call, it's what we call in consumer law mandated disclosure, right? So reviews have a complementary function, but they have more, because empirical research, and there's a lot of empirical research on the topic, non-legal empirical research, but still, shows that most consumers look only at mandated disclosures after they read reviews. So online reviews work kind of as a gatekeeper between the consumer and mandated disclosure. And then we have, even a worse situation, which is that 30% of consumers claim that they don't even read mandated disclosures, they just read online reviews. So in this situation, reviews don't even work as a complement, they work as a substitute of mandated disclosure. And therefore, for these two reasons, it's important for legal scholars and for consumer lawyers to ask, okay, but then if the information that, for example, European directives mandates the disclosure of, if that's not being read, then what information are consumers reading? What information is, factually influencing consumers' contractual decisions? So that brings me to the questions that I will superficially approach here. I will be, very glad to discuss any of these issues after the presentation. So first is exactly what I was mentioning. What information is shaping consumers' contractual consent? What information is being disclosed through reviews? The second is, to what extent is pre-contractual information, so online reviews, controlled by online platforms? And I would like to make a small remark, because I mean, if we all know that the role of online platforms nowadays is a hot topic of legal debate, mainly because of their role as social media platforms, content moderators, the gatekeepers of misinformation, of hate speech, etc. But when it comes to the private sphere, online platforms have an equally important role as gatekeepers of information, because online platforms are obviously the first and foremost regulator of all this pre-contractual information that all these millions of consumers read. So to what extent do they control that information that is disclosed? And finally, this is my question of the general question of my PhD. What can we learn from online reviews that we can use to improve the information paradigm? I won't answer this question here. I will be finishing my PhD in the next couple of months, so I can tell you more about that in a bit. But it transpires from my thoughts. So this is a bit of a summary of what Pedro already said. Online reviews are, at the moment, an object of EU regulation, also national regulation. The European Union has been talking about reviews almost for a decade now. So there are studies already commissioned by the European Commission in 2011, 2012 that talk about review mechanisms. And every year since then, there's been some sort of policy statement or communication from the Commission that discusses reviews. And the approach or the perspective that the European Union has on this is very uniform. Is online reviews are good, but they're also a problem, and we must regulate them. Not exclusively in coordination with private actors, but still. Also at national level, we see that the consumer protection authorities have been very active recently, also because of COVID, in fighting fake reviews. But so this first approach is online reviews as an object of regulation. But then you can, of course, look at reviews as a source of regulation or inspiration for regulation. First of all, we can see how online reviews regulate reputation. They provide economic incentives for truth-telling. They regulate trust in contracts. That also has been explained. The second point, and this is something that I'm very insisting on when I discuss online reviews with my colleagues, which is that online reviews are, a huge source of consumer behavioral data. They're a repository of consumer behavioral data, because not only do we have millions and millions of reviews available, we have considerable amounts of non-legal empirical research on consumer informational preferences. What information do consumers want? What information do consumers find helpful? What information do consumers share or think it's important to share? And The last time I was at a conference with Professor Ben Shahar, who wrote one of the prominent books on this topic, I remember he said, whoever is trying to suggest a solution or another solution for the information paradigm has to back it on consumer data. And so this online reviews can be used for sure as a source of consumer data. Then if we look at online reviews as pre-contractual information, we can insert it in a contract law framework. So contract law rules apply, rules such as defects of consent, maybe pre-contractual liability, culpa in contrahendo. They apply if we consider online reviews as pre-contractual information. And finally, as I said, online reviews can be looked at as a complement or substitute of information duties. Now let's look at what information is disclosed through online reviews. As I said, there's a lot of research on this. It's very interesting to read. Marketing is a field that studies online reviews a lot. And from that research, what we can conclude are two different things. First, what information is actually factually disclosed through reviews? And second, what information do consumers prefer or find helpful? And these are two different things. We can use them for regulation in two different ways. But so consumers want, maybe this is not very surprising, but consumers want short information. The reviews, for example, no, sorry, this is what information is disclosed, but also true for what consumers want. But so reviews are generally short, although there's some differences. For example, I think on booking.com, the mean length is 181 characters. That's, for context, two sentences on a Word document. But on Amazon, it's 186 words. Then reviews convey mainly subjective elements, also some objective elements. Reviews convey user pattern information. Reviews personalize that information, or they have some personal elements of the experience of the reviewer. Most importantly, reviews convey aggregated information, because the reverse side of online reviews are online ratings, right? If you go to a hotel and you see that it's 7.5, not only do you have all the subjective information inherent to reviews, but you know that the majority of reviewers consider that that's an average hotel or a good hotel. Then I also conducted an empirical study of my own for my PhD. I looked at 600 reviews from 20 different products from 7 different platforms. I measured the levels of contextualization. So to what extent do reviews contextualize information? I will talk about that in a bit. Most reviews convey opinions and not explicit recommendations. So there's usually no explicit, best path to follow. And finally, topics covered are mainly quality in product or service characteristics. So there is definitely an overlap here between mandated disclosure and online reviews. But importantly, there's no information on legal rights. So that was my conclusion from my studies. But then what information do consumers prefer? Again, easy to read information, concrete information, short, but unsurprisingly, or maybe surprisingly, not the shortest. So this myth that the consumer wants the most straightforward, shortest information is not true. Consumers prefer reviews on quality of the product rather than on characteristics of the product. They want, ideally, a balance between subjective and objective elements and information on real-world setting use of the product. So, I could also spend a lot of time discussing how this could be inspirational for EU regulation. But one of the points I want to raise in this presentation is how most of these studies, first of all, there's, as I said, very few studies. I don't think there's any study or very few studies in European consumer law on empirical analysis of reviews. But even these non-legal studies, there's a low, people don't really take into account the heterogeneity of reviews. And that is a challenge for legal scholars as well. So what do I mean? Reviews don't all convey the same type of information. There's a difference between reviews on a certain product or on a certain platform, and that will be a challenge for academics or scholars or practitioners from a legal perspective to then come to a legal definition of reviews. To give you an example, quite visual example, this is an example of a review on IKEA on a office chair. You don't have to read it, obviously. Just, memorize the length, and then you can see how this is a review on children's pajamas on Amazon. They're both kind of the same type of product in the sense that, legally speaking, they're both goods. But you can tell that not only the length is very different, the type of information is very, very different. While this is completely subjective, the previous review was quite technical as well. So, this is an example of the heterogeneity that we see in reviews. there's different business models underlying the provision of reviews. You have the platforms that, whose main object are exactly the provision of reviews, like Yelp or Trustpilot. Then you have, the situations where the platform is an intermediary between the consumer and the business, but allows for reviews on the business, such as the case of Booking.com. Then you have the case of Amazon, for example, where they sell third-party material, not always, but they also sell third-party material and allow for reviews on that product. And then you have the case of, for example, IKEA, that sells the products, but also allows for reviews on the products itself. So we already have a difference on business models. Then we have differently designed mechanisms. So each platform has different, designs or policies in place. I'm also going to talk about that in a little bit. And most of all, there's actually differences when it comes to the type of information disclosed through reviews according to both product and platform. So in my study, just to give you some preliminary results, there are huge differences. So I looked at 600 reviews, and the degree of objectivity varied between 10% and 95%. The same for contextualization. It varies between 5% and 90%. And it's not only between random abstract groups of reviews, but when we compare the same type of product, so for example, digital content versus digital content on different platforms, there's also differences. And when we compare the same platform on the same type of products, so goods, we can also see substantial heterogeneity. Now, what does this mean and why does this matter? Obviously, it matters for a proper regulation of review mechanisms. It matters for an understanding of consumer behavior and understanding of consumer informational needs. And as I said, from my perspective, it matters for a contract law perspective. If we want to see to what extent these contract law rules apply to reviews, we need to come up with a legal definition of reviews. So are reviews a subjective statement? Are reviews an objective statement? Are reviews a means through which there's the provision of advice? Is it a recommendation? What does this mean when it comes to liability? So, this step of getting to know what information is disclosed is quite crucial. But then we have, my last point, which is the online platform's control over pre-contractual information, so over reviews. In my study, I also compared different policies of Amazon, IKEA, Booking.com, Trustpilot, Yelp, Google Play, and TripAdvisor, and they were picked because they represent different business models. And I was interested in checking to what extent did these platforms exactly controlled reviews. So they exerted an act of control, let's say. And I looked at 4 aspects. I looked at content-related measures, non-content-related measures, enforcement and sanctions, and assumption of liability. I'm not going to summarize all the conclusions, but I'm going to say that I was surprised, because my impression was that most platforms exerted a sort of passive control, in the sense that they had some checks for fake reviews. But all platforms showed some level of control over both content and non-content related aspects. And this means that, of course, most platforms have impositions of what should and should not be in the review. And that mainly concerns public values. For example, all platforms that I analyze have measures in place that say, we cannot have hate speech or discriminatory speech. But interestingly, there's also some guidelines as to what should be in the review. So not only what should not be, but also what should be. Then almost all platforms show, enforcement systems, pre-posting checks, post-posting checks, suspicious review flagging mechanisms, and Trustpilot even has a whistleblower system, which I found very interesting. And of course, all platforms deny liability. But then I was interested to see to what extent were these, guidelines for reviews mere guidelines, or they were actually more of a rule. And there are sanctions associated to a breach of these guidelines. So the first sanction is removal of the review. Then most platforms, not all platforms, but most platforms stated that there would be a determination of the account or termination of the contract completely. So if you write a fake review or an inaccurate review or a discriminatory review, Amazon might terminate your account and might terminate, your ability to buy and sell through Amazon. It's interesting to see also that the grounds of termination vary according to the platform. So Trustpilot says that A violation of ethical standards might justify the termination of the contract, while Amazon's is a bit broader. It says a single violation of any review guidelines would justify the termination of the contract. And then the other important aspect is that also the level of control varies considerably between these platforms. And why does this matter? Well, first of all, it matters, I didn't talk about it here, but for the regime of the e-commerce directive, which is now going to be amended by the Digital Services Act. Maybe we'll have a talk on that, on the Digital Services Act at some point. And, you know, it says that platforms can be exempted from liability if they're mere hosts of information. So if they have hosting functions. And they can be considered as having a hosting function if they exert mere passive control. So, you know, it's not clear. A one-size-fits-all solution will not work here. Then it also matters because I wanted to assess to what extent can these reviews be said to be the platform's statement and not a third-party statement and not a consumer statement. So what level of control do they exert here? If we were to consider them a platform statement, which I'm going to say it can be true for some platforms, but not for all, exactly because of these differences in the level of control. If we could say that, then we can imagine wilder things when it comes to contract law. For example, can online platforms justify compliance with information duties via their review mechanism? So if online platforms, you know, miss or don't disclose information on a certain aspect, but then they say, well, but listen, this aspect is mentioned in all the reviews in our website. So, you know, that's why this analysis of the platform's control is relevant. This is the end of my presentation. My main goal was to kind of widen the lens when it comes to looking at reviews, not only as a source of problems when it comes to fake reviews, but a source of solutions as well. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Madalena, for a great presentation. And now I will pass to Professor Christoph Busch. Thank you so much for being here. The floor is yours now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge, for inviting me to this fascinating panel on online reviews. And thank you to Madalena and Pedro for their talks. I was asked to make some comments, so I don't have a presentation, but I have a few observations and comments on the topic. I would like to focus on, I think, 3 or 4 elements. And these are elements, I think, of an emerging regulatory framework for online reviews in Europe. Until recently, there was almost nothing except the, let's say, very broad, very general requirements from the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, but no specific provisions. But this is rapidly changing now, and it's changing in various parts of EU legislation, various elements that come together and that raise a couple of questions. And my first question would be, is transparency sufficient? Transparency requirements for online reviews, or is it necessary to impose some sort of design duties that impose how some minimum requirements for a trustworthy reputation system? So far, the EU seems to focus on transparency rules, as Pedro showed from the modernization directive. But if you take the example of reasonable steps to check that reviews really originate from consumers. Article 7, the revised Article 7 requires, of the UCPD, requires sellers to inform about whether and how they take such steps, but there is no duty to take such steps. One might ask whether this new number 23B from the blacklist that Pedro referred to imposes an indirect requirement to take reasonable and proportionate checks, because if you interpret this provision, this prohibition of stating that reviews originate from consumers without taking reasonable steps, if you interpret this extensively, and if you say that the way how reviews are displayed on many platforms implicitly states that these reviews have been submitted really by consumers, and if there is no mechanism behind this that ensures it, that's already a violation of of this provision. I'm not so sure. That would maybe go too far to read an indirect duty, not just to make true statements, but to take reasonable steps to ensure the authenticity. So at the moment, I think we're still at the level of transparency duties. But is this sufficient? Take the example of incentivized reviews, for example, reviews where you get a discount code or some other benefit. Pedro mentioned the problem that there is a lack of reviews, a lack especially of average reviews. And economists seem to explain this by the fact that reviews are public goods that everyone can enjoy without providing any reviews themselves. So there's usually a lack of supply of such public goods. So some sort of incentive might help solve this problem. So incentives are maybe not inherently bad or dubious. The problem is if the incentive leads to a biased review, then we get a problem. So maybe a regulatory need would be to limit the incentives, to set a limit for the type or for the amount of incentives that could be given, or somehow regulate incentivized reviews, not prohibit them, but regulate them. And that might be more than just transparency saying this is an incentivized review. So I think that's an open question, whether, especially with regard to incentivized reviews, transparency is sufficient. If you follow me, that maybe we need a bit more than just transparency, the second question is, what would be the proper regulatory design for regulating online review systems? As Madalena said, review systems come in a broad variety of types. There's a broad variety of system designs. So if you lay down regulatory requirements that are too strict, this puts a straitjacket on platforms as regards how they can design their reputation systems, and that would reduce innovation and competition among platforms for the best review system. So you would probably need some rules that provide enough flexibility to platform operators to design a workable system. And also looking at technological development, these rules should be technologically neutral. But usually technologically neutral rules are very broad, very open, and create some sort of legal uncertainty. So maybe it would be necessary to have a second layer that gives a bit more detail. And those of you who know the ELI model rules, who had a look at them, probably know that Article 5 of the ELI model rules shows how such a system could look like, a combination of a general provision, which only lays down that reputation systems should follow the requirements of professional diligence. That's a general clause, very open, technologically neutral. But then the second layer is a technical standard, like the already existing ISO standard 204/88 from 2018. It's confusing, these numbers of the ISO standards, but I think that's right, 204/88. And when we drafted the ELI model rules in our working group, we thought that you could link these two levels with a presumption of conformity. a platform operator, the operator of a reputation system, is presumed to be in compliance with the requirements of professional diligence if the platform operator follows the standard, the ISO standard. But there are other ways to show that you follow the requirements of professional diligence. So there's no obligation to follow the standard, but there's an obligation to follow the requirements of professional diligence. So that might be one way to have a regulatory design that is flexible on the one hand, but gives sufficient legal certainty on the other hand. And the third point that I would like to raise, that has also been touched upon by Madalena, that's procedure. That's due process with regard to reviews, and especially with regard to taking down reviews, deleting reviews. And I think that's a very important and an emerging issue with regard to the regulatory design. We've seen a general trend towards what you might say proceduralization, or a procedural turn in platform regulation. You can see this in the P2B regulation, where complaint handling procedures play an important role. You can also see this in the Digital Services Act, with the requirement to give a statement of reasons when information is deleted. That's Article 15 of the DSA proposal, and the complaint handling procedure, Article 17, and even an out-of-court dispute settlement procedure, Article 18. And these provisions might also be applied to the deleting of online reviews. With regard to the P2B regulation, I think Article 11, that's the complaint handling provision of the P2B regulation, you could already apply this and open the door for a business to use this complaint handling mechanism if a positive review is taken down and the platform says, well, we believe that's a fake review, we delete this, or we don't display this. With regard to the DSA proposal, I'm not so sure, because if you look at Article 15, the duty to state reasons, and Article 17, the complaint handling procedure, the duty to state reasons is a duty towards the person who has provided the information, which in our case means the author of the review. But I would think most consumers, if they get an email saying, we have deleted your review, they will not fight for it. They would say, oh, well, that's it. I don't waste time on this. For the business, it's more problematic if positive reviews get deleted. And there has been case law on this, especially with regard to Yelp in Germany more recently. But Article 15 does not require the platform to give reasons to the business that has been the object of the review. So I think that there might be a need, because this is a type of information that is deleted that is not only relevant for the author, but also relevant for the business that the review is about. So I think proceduralization, due process around reviews might be something that is on the rise, but that may be further developed. If there were more time, I would also talk about portability of reviews, which is a favorite, which is very dear to my heart, and which I think is also on the rise, because it is part of a bigger topic, which is digital identities. Reputation, positive reputational capital linked to digital identities, but that's maybe something for another Nova Consumer Talk. So I will stop here, and so we have some time for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christoph, for your great comment on the talks. I will ask Pedro or Madalena if they want to answer this.
I can comment on the first topic that Professor Christoph touched, which is transparency. I think that the ability of the reputational mechanisms to reduce information asymmetries in the peer-to-peer economy is something that should be praised. it's something that is great, but information does not always mean more knowledge, particularly when there's still little transparency on how ratings and reviews are processed. And even though the legislative efforts of the EU are something that should also be praised, I think that the mechanisms for online reputation will be even more effective in managing risks if they process information in a more clear and more accountable way, if they are better regulated. And so if consumers are empowered with greater transparency regarding how the reviews are processed, the accountability, there's an accountability deficits in reputational mechanisms. And this is something that could be addressed with more transparency. I think it's a good idea.
I can also say something, because Professor Busch mentioned the ELI model rules on online platforms. And one of the things that I like the most about the regulation of online reviews in that document was that there's actually, if I'm not mistaken, a definition of online reviews, I believe. And that is absent from directives at European level, and that can answer some problems like, what do we do about influencer marketing? What are considered reviews? What is considered more than social media endorsements? What is it within the scope of these rules? Also, because aside from these user reviews or consumer reviews, we have professional reviews. We have YouTubers, for example. We have those are reviews. There are people that and it's even like a peer review sort of situation, because they started out as consumers, but then they professionalized. So where does that fall under? Because most of these writings that we see when we talk about reviews, I think we have in mind a typical Amazon review, but that's why I think a definition of online reviews is definitely a good point and something to think about in the future.
Thank you, Madalena. I'm sure we have here a few topics to further discussion in following topics, and also for the researchers of the Nova Consumer Lab who are here. I think they have very interesting topics to research. I will now open the floor for anyone wants to ask a question, make a comment on this topic. Floor is yours, please. Just let me know if you want to. Fabrizio.
So thank you to all the presentations and also the comment of Professor Busch. So what I would like to bring to the table is especially from a law and economics perspective, especially because Professor Busch was mentioning all the perverse and delicate incentive recipes that we need to consider here. One of the things that I always find very counterintuitive but fascinating is the argument of using a merciless hammer in the form of a strict liability. So the consumer. And how would that work? The consumer who is disappointed because what is what is described in some of the reviews doesn't match his own experience, is going to have a claim. And this claim, if the responsibility on the quality of the review is on the platform, this claim is going to be against the platform. Of course, then we can start to distinguish which features of an online review would make sense to be actionable under a strict liability standard of this form. But this gives to the economic argument that this gives all sort of positive incentives to minimize the likelihood of the disappointment of the consumer, because the online platform doesn't have any other defense but the fact that the consumer is not disappointed in the first place.
Thank you, Fabrizio, for your question. We also have here a question from Ana Ferreira Neves. Do you think platforms are obliged to translate the reviews in local language? I don't know who wants to answer both questions or comment on any of the questions.
I can, let me just see the question
Thank you,
in the chat.
Madalena.
Yeah, well, I can tell you from a descriptive perspective, some platforms actually include provisions on this on their terms and conditions, and they explicitly say, you know, by posting a review on TripAdvisor or whatever, I don't remember the specific platform, two things can happen. They either say we are not obliged to translate it, or they say we are entitled to use it as marketing in other countries. So this is a descriptive perspective. Normatively, I admit I never thought about this, but I wouldn't see a reason to make it a mandatory to translate reviews in local language. This is all I can tell you.
Thank you very much. Busch, Christoph, do you want to add something?
Well, maybe just a brief reaction to Fabrizio's point. I think the link between online reviews and liability, platform liability, is a very important issue. There's currently a case pending in the New York courts about actually an influencer. A lady who designs clothing and jewelry, and who bought some diet product on Amazon. And this diet product caused harm to her, and she had to go to hospital. And now she's suing Amazon. And one of the questions that has been raised there is whether Amazon should have verified the reviews that had been posted about this product there, and some of these reviews mentioned the dangerous quality of this diet product. So the case is still pending, but I think it also shows that there's this tension between whether these reviews provide information to consumers, or whether they also contain information that platforms should consider. So there's a sort of ambivalent function, information function of these reviews that is closely related to platform liability, I think. Yes, indeed.
Thank you very much. We still have time for one more question maximum. Well, we don't have time, but we can. I think we can find time to another question if there's any question. No, so I think we can finish now. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Pedro. Thank you so much, Madalena, for your great presentations, and thank you so much, Christoph, for your comments on the presentations and for your analysis here. Thank you so much to all, and hope to see you soon. Keep safe, all of you, and hope to meet you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Have a nice week. Bye.